Get used to this cell, 'cause this is where you'll be spending the next few days until you die.
Yeah, there's nowhere for you to run now, you traitorous scum.
What do you plan to do with me?
Well, torture, execution, maybe a little bit of both. Speaking of which, go get the hot poker.
I'm on it.
My God, you bastards truly are sick.
Yeah, that's right. Well, when you betray the crown, you get what's coming to you. Oh, here it is, nice and hot.
All right, I'm not afraid. Do your worst. Take that hot poker and go ahead and shove it up my ass.
What?
What?
You heard me. I'm not afraid. Take that red hot poker of yours, spread these cheeks and shove it in my ass.
What? No one said anything about shoving it in your ass.
Well, what were you gonna do with it?
Maybe hold it to the bottom of your feet? At the worst, gouge your eyes out, but...
Oh, I see. Getting soft on me now, huh? Finally growing a conscience? Well, now it's too late. Go ahead. Do what you were intending to do. Shove it in my ass.
Listen, no one wants to shove anything up your ass, okay?
Cowards!
You know what? Whatever. Tomorrow you're gonna die anyway at the end of a rope, okay?
Tomorrow?
Why wait until then? Do it now. Bundle up that rope and shove it in my ass.
No one's gonna shove anything up your ass.
Don't have the guts for it, do you?
It sounds like you want someone to shove something up your ass.
Come on, I'll even make it easy on you. Here!
Oh,
whoa,
God,
whoa!
Dude!
Come on! Here it is! Right there! I'll even put this funnel in there. Ah, yeah! Go ahead, do your worst.
Jesus, would you put your pants back on?
That's disgusting.
God, you are obnoxious. I can see now why they threw the book at you.
Yeah, that's right. Take that book and shove it right here in my ass.
You know what? This job is not even worth it. I can't take this anymore. I'm done. I quit.
What? Come on, Steve, I just got you this job.
Bill, you can take this job and shove it up your ass.
Or you can shove it up my ass.
Shut up!
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
And you have arrived in the medieval village just outside the castle. That's right, the winds are howling, crickets chirping, then off in the distance, that's right, the hounds of Creep Street are calling, folks. Once again, we are headed over to the windswept heart of the UK, this time in the Midlands, a little area known as Norfolk. There you can find the ruins of Castle Rising, still looming like the bones of a long-dead giant, a silent reminder of a time when knights clashed in iron armor and every noble of wealth and title needed stone walls to keep the world at bay. Well, Castle Rising is famous for sheltering a woman who was both royal and reviled. And she is the subject of today's episode. Isabella, the she-wolf queen. That's right. And let me just claw at you with my source here. The Best of British Ghost Stories, Volume 8, by Sophie Jackson. And, of course, Queen Isabella, the so-called she-wolf of France, she was the wife of the doomed Edward II. And Isabella's story is one soaked in scandal. And rumors have traveled through the centuries that claim she may have even orchestrated her husband's murder, and that she pulled the strings that led to his bloody end. Now, some say that her son, King Edward III, banished her to Castle Rising as punishment for her traitorous deeds. The truth, as always, is a little more complicated, as we have well learned here on Creep Street. Isabella wasn't a prisoner here, not technically. She lived out her final years surrounded by luxury, tapestries, fine gowns, hunting parties, and feasts. But depending on who is telling the story, well, that story might change considerably. Because if Isabella did betray the English crown, well, it would make sense why English histories would not paint her in the best light. The same goes for Castle Rising, because for all of its splendor, it would become the stage for something much darker. The story of Castle Rising doesn't begin with Isabella, though. Like so many old structures across England, it was born from ambition and blood. The castle itself was erected around 1138 by William d'Aubigny II, a man whose family had crossed over from Normandy in the wake of the conquest. Born just a few years after William the Conqueror stormed the island, d'Aubigny grew up in a brutal world, one that prioritized power, loyalty, and the strength of your sword arm. Well, ambitious and cunning, William rose through the ranks quickly. He fought for King Stephen during the bitter civil war that ripped England apart after Henry I's death. Then he served Henry II with fierce loyalty, helping him to earn titles and land. First, he was made the Earl of Arundel, and then the Earl of Lincoln.
Lincoln. Isn't Matthew McConaughey the Earl of Lincoln?
I think if you ask anyone today, absolutely. Earl of Lincoln. Time is a flat circle here at Castle Rising. All right. But William, he wasn't just another blood-soaked noble. No. William also had a streak of something rare for his time. A bit of charity. He used part of his fortune to build a leper hospital not that far from Castle Rising, a place where the sick and abandoned were shown mercy in a historical landscape otherwise ruled by violence and greed. Well, the year that William d'Aubigny laid the first stones of Castle Rising, he also made a power move that would change his fate forever. He married Adeliza, the widow of King Henry I, and with her came not just beauty, but serious wealth. Some serious cha-ching, folks. Flush with new fortunes and new influence, William's ego began to swell a little bit to match the towers he was building. One chronicler at the time cynically posited that William had become, quote, intolerably puffed up and looked down upon every other eminence in the world except the king. Well, once again, perhaps that is true, but history, as we know, looks different depending on where you're viewing it from. And William didn't waste time in flaunting his newfound wealth and status. With Adeliza's riches burning a hole in his pockets, William built 2 new castles and expanded on a third. Stone and mortar weren't just for defense anymore, baby. No. They were monuments to a man that thought he could carve his legacy into the very bones of England itself. Oh, but legacies have a way of twisting themselves into curses. Despite all of its grandeur, Castle Rising was never truly built for war. Strategically, it was rather useless. The land was poor and the surrounding area barely populated, and from a military point of view, it held no real value. Some would say that William chose the spot simply because the land itself was cheap. At first, it might have been meant as nothing more than an oversized hunting lodge, a place to show off without worrying too much about battle or sieges. But like everything else William d'Aubigny touched, Castle Rising began to grow. By 1145, it had swelled into something much more powerful. William was even granted the right to open a mint within the castle walls, meaning he didn't just rule from Castle Rising, he literally made his own money there. stamping his name into the kingdom one coin at a time. And when William d'Aubigny finally died, Castle Rising didn't fall silent. It passed like a crown from hand to hand, first to his son, and then to his grandson, William IV, the man who served the infamous King John and died overseas, coming home from the bloody sands of the Fifth Crusade. The curse of the castle seemed to direct itself around them. His great-grandson inherited the estate next, but he died childless, so it then passed to his brother Hugh, and Hugh likewise left no heirs to walk its halls. So with no bloodlines left to claim it, Castle Rising passed to a new name, Roger de Montalt. But no matter who owned it, the stones kept its memories of blood and ambition. The Montalts were a big name once, a solid baronial family, but by the early 1300s, their fortunes were starting to rot. In 1327, Roger de Montalt's younger brother Robert, who had inherited Castle Rising, sold the rights back to the crown. He negotiated a lifetime lease for himself and his wife Emma, a desperate attempt to cling to a fading legacy. At the time, the country itself was a house of cards, and holding it all together for the moment were Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer. They ruled England as regents for the young King Edward III, but everyone knew it couldn't last. When Edward came of age, he moved fast against his mother and her lover. Mortimer was executed, hanged like a common traitor, and Isabella, his own mother, was spared but pushed into the shadows. She didn't fight it either. She retired from public life, disgraced but still a royal and very much alive. Emma de Montalt, now a widow, sold her rights to Castle Rising to Isabella, and thus the fallen queen moved in. This lonely fortress in the windswept Norfolk fields would become the last stage for the she-wolf of France, a queen without a throne, a predator without a hunt. Isabella stayed at Castle Rising for the rest of her life, a queen without a crown, but never without comfort. With a generous yearly income courtesy of her son, King Edward III, she lived in luxury behind the gray stone walls of the castle. Minstrels sang for her, huntsmen rode out into the tangled woods at her command, grooms tended to her stables, her silks, and her aging but still formidable dignity. And yet, despite all of the wealth flowing into Castle Rising, Isabella still managed to drown herself in debt. Mama liked to spend. Local merchants grumbled that the she-wolf of France was quick to take but slow to pay, another queenly habit she never quite shook off. The walls might have been filled with music and feasting, but something inside them was quietly festering. When Isabella's long and complicated life finally ended in 1358, Castle Rising didn't fall silent for long. The castle passed into the hands of her grandson, Edward the Black Prince, one of the most feared and celebrated warriors of his age. Under his watch, Castle Rising got a second breath of life. He ordered repairs to one of its towers, a structure known back then as the Nightingale Tower, though today no one's really sure which crumbling piece of stone it actually was. The Black Prince never lived long enough to wear the crown he was promised. He died before his father, leaving behind only a young son to carry the weight of a kingdom. When King Edward III finally passed, the crown, and Castle Rising with it, fell into the hands of Richard II, a boy of just 10 years old, too young to remember the wars, too young to understand the blood that still clung to the castle walls. But in England, youth has never been a shield against the demands of power. Richard II's reign was chaos stitched together with gold thread. Beautiful from a distance, of course, but always fraying at the seam. During his rule, Castle Rising passed through several hands, including two of Richard's own uncles. But after Richard's downfall and subsequent death, the courts stepped in, declaring those transfers illegal. The castle was yanked back into royal control, falling into the possession of Henry V, a king who knew a thing or two about blood and legacy. And as the years rolled forward, Castle Rising's role began to change. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It became a hunting lodge, a country retreat for nobility who wanted the thrill of the chase without the burden of remembering all the battles fought in the shadows of its walls. Ironically, very similar to what D'Aubigny had first constructed all those years ago. But stones refused to forget, and so did the dead. By the end of the 15th century, Castle Rising was crumbling. The grandeur was gone, eaten away by time, weather, and neglect. A report written somewhere between 1503 and 1506 described the place as being in, quote, evil repair. The great roof of the keep rotted clean away, letting the cold rain pour straight into the heart of the ruin. Another survey wasn't any kinder. It suggested that the castle needed to be repaired immediately or simply torn down completely. It had become dangerous to even step foot inside of. Either way, the message was clear. Castle Rising's time was over. Only its bones still stood. Everything else was too broken, and indeed even too haunted to be buried. Some half-hearted attempts were made to save Castle Rising. A new set of lodgings was built among the ruins, but that was just like slapping a fresh coat of paint on a sinking ship. It wasn't enough, not even close. By the 1540s, the castle was a wreck. The roof and inner floors of the keep had collapsed into themselves, and every year the cost of repairing the heap crept higher. Time was eating away at both the castle's structure as well as its prestige. It was in this crumbling, sad state that Castle Rising was gifted to the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, in 1544 by none other than Henry VIII himself. Howard himself wasn't just another noble, he was the uncle of two of Henry's doomed wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. At first, the castle must have surely seemed like a prize, but as we know, fate can often have a sick sense of humor. Only 2 years after receiving Castle Rising, Thomas Howard fell out of favor with the king and was soon rotting in the Tower of London, waiting for the axe to drop, the same axe that had already claimed so many of his bloodline. The only thing that saved him, though, was the death of Henry VIII himself. One final twist of fate in a kingdom built on betrayal. Castle Rising now had a new master, but it remained as ever a place where loyalty meant little, and looking over your shoulder was the name of the game. It's doubtful that Thomas Howard ever actually even laid eyes on Castle Rising, and if he did, he clearly had no desire to breathe any life back into the rotting stone. Let's face it, Henry VIII dying was a dang close call for Thomas Howard, and it wouldn't at all be surprising if he didn't want anything to do with the place. The castle was essentially a poisoned gift, and Howard treated it like one, letting it fester quietly on the edge of his holdings. 30 years after he inherited it, another survey was taken, and boy, the findings were grim. It was estimated that about 2,000 British pounds, a staggering fortune at the time, would be needed to make the place livable again. And if they knocked the whole thing down and sold the materials, they doubted they could even scrap together 66 pounds. To give you an idea, 2K pounds in the 1570s would be anywhere from 10 to 20 million in today's currency. Castle Rising had become a ghost, too broken to fix, but oh baby, too stubborn to die. The future of Castle Rising, once the glittering refuge of Queen Isabella, was past the point of saving. The outer walls and the buildings that had once bustled with life were torn down, leaving behind only the hollowed-out keep. the broken stone latrines and the battered remains of the chapel. The grandeur was gone. The laughter, the scheming, the betrayals, all of the drama of history, all swallowed by the indifferent gulf of time. The only inhabitant now was nature. Rabbits digging their burrows through the dead foundations, turning the ruins into a home for creatures who couldn't care less about the blood that was spilt there. And over the next 100 years, Castle Rising was picked apart like a carcass. The gravel floor of the keep was dug up, carted away to patch roads, while stones were stripped from its walls to build a simple sluice gate. Piece by piece, and somewhat poetically, the castle bled into the countryside it once ruled. And yet somehow the Howard family still held on to what was left of it. It wasn't until Mary Howard and her husband, Fulk Greenville Howard, came along that anyone seemed to care about preserving the battered ruins. They ordered repairs to the keep. They excavated the inner bailey. And for the first time in centuries, Castle Rising seemed to breathe with new life again. But restoration comes at a price. Their digging uncovered the old Norman chapel, but it also destroyed layers of medieval history that can never be recovered. Saving the castle came at the cost of erasing part of its soul. The restoration efforts dragged on into the new century. By 1900, the castle was finally open to the public, a battered monument to its past, both good and ugly. A lone caretaker was assigned to watch over the ruins, living in a rough little house tucked into a corner of the crumbling keep. It wasn't much of a living quarters, with just enough shelter to survive the cold and damp, but something other than the caretaker still lurked in the ruins of Castle Rising. By 1958, the place was once again falling into a dangerous state of disrepair. The Ministry of Works stepped in, taking legal custody of the site, though technically it still remained under the name of the Howard family. Regardless, though, real conservation could finally now begin. The ancient stones were stabilized. Crumbling walls shored up, and after centuries of tunneling through the ruins, those pesky rabbits were evicted from their warrens, their burrows having done as much damage to the castle as any siege or battle could ever do. In 1983, English Heritage took over the care of Castle Rising, locking it in place as one of Britain's officially protected ancient monuments. Now, visitors can walk its tattered halls, climb its battered stairs, and even stand in the same places where power once whispered and conspired. But the castle is more than just weathered stone and roped-off corridors. Anyone who's been there will tell you that the castle still feels watched. And it's not surprising, of course, that the most famous ghost tied to Castle Rising is, of course, Isabella herself, the she-wolf of France. Her reputation and nickname alone is enough to fill one with a sense of foreboding. She was a woman accused of regicide, treason, forbidden love, and a murderous insanity. Some say she never truly left.
She was almost a canine Karen.
That's right, exactly. Now, what we just did there, we gave you kind of a quick run of just the whole castle's history up until today. Now we can sink our teeth into the meaty parts here. The main course, past the au gratin potatoes, all have a second helping. Because Isabella's story begins far from Castle Rising, across the channel in the courts of France. Born the daughter of a king, she was handed over to England for marriage, aka a cynical diplomatic offering, a royal child exchanged for a tenuous peace. She married Edward II when she was still just a girl, and folks, he was a grown man. She was literally 12 years old. Quite nasty.
She's 12, she's grown, she's ready to get married.
I know, 12, good lord.
She's just sitting at home, taking up space.
I know, get a job.
Yeah.
Get a job.
It's time.
But like I said, her childhood was already marred by death and mystery. Her mother had died when she was young under suspicious circumstances, and though some at the time suspected murder, modern historians cast doubt on it. Still, it set the tone. Isabella's world was one where queens were exchanged like chess pieces, and power always came at a cost. By 16, she had given birth to their first son, Edward III. She was a teenager crowned in motherhood, trapped in a kingdom not her own, married to a man more interested in his male favorites than his queen, aka Edward II, was actually into dudes. Isabella was learning early in royal courts that love is very, very rare, but leverage is everything. Well, Edward II, he was a king who never quite fit the mold. Controversy clung to him like a second skin. Rumors of affairs with his male favorites, specifically with Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser the Younger, followed him everywhere. And whether or not they were actually true wasn't the point. What mattered was that everyone believed it, regardless. Edward's relations with his favorites infuriated the barons, turning allies into enemies and his court into a political battlefield. Revolts against his reign flared again and again, and through it all, Isabella stood by his side, at least at first. But naturally, a rift began to form between the two of them. Their mirage of a marriage became like a wound for Isabella, festering with estrangement, resentment, and betrayal. But finally, Isabella made her move. While on a diplomatic mission in her home country of France, she got together with her lover, Roger Mortimer. And with him at her side, she launched a full-scale revolt against her own husband. Edward II was captured, humiliated, and not long after, died in captivity. Some say he was murdered in a way so brutal that the very telling of it turns the stomach. Of all the brutal ends that have befallen history's fallen royals, few match the macabre infamy of the legend surrounding Edward II's death. Buckle up if you're a little squeamish, because this one it's a little rough, folks. It's a little rough. According to the legend, King Edward II of England didn't die by the blade or even by poison, but by something far more grotesque. It's said that in 1327, inside the cold, damp walls of Berkeley Castle, Edward was murdered with a red-hot poker forced up his ass in a calculated act of torture so horrific it's haunted English folklore for centuries. Here is how the legend goes. After being ousted, Edward was thrown into a miserable cell in the bowels of Berkeley Castle. Now, executing a former king outright risked stirring up rebellion from his remaining allies. So, allegedly, the conspirators chose a method of murder that would leave no marks. Nothing that would scream regicide on the outside, but boy oh boy, would it sure hurt on the inside. On the night of September the 21st of 1327, Edward's captors supposedly held him down, inserted some kind of a horn or funnel into his rear, and then slid a red-hot poker through it, incinerating his internal organs without leaving a trace on the outside of his body. They say his screams rang through the castle halls, bouncing off the stone walls, echoing with agony, but no one came to help. No one wanted to know. The goal, clean corpse with no evidence. Just the announcement of a sickly monarch who conveniently didn't make it through the night. It's a tale so lurid and depraved that even centuries later, historians can't decide whether it was just propaganda or some sort of sick poetic justice, or just England's most horrifying royal urban legend.
God, I can't imagine that. I mean,
I know. And let's be honest, obviously, we're talking medieval times. If he actually did have same-sex dalliances with other men, obviously that would not be, given the time, looked down on. So you can also imagine it was probably a dark, cruel way of kind of commenting on that as well. So very hateful, whether or not he was a good king or obviously he didn't mind marrying a 12-year-old and whatnot, but his homosexuality, obviously, looking through it through today's lens, we know was obviously not a crime and whatnot. But yeah, while we don't know for sure if that happened, it's, wow. It makes for
about as cruel a punishment as you can imagine.
It's very Game of Thrones. It's like something like something you'd hear in like an episode of Game of Thrones. It's brutal, absolutely brutal. And they say that the order came from Isabella herself. Whatever the truth behind Edward's death, for a time, Isabella lived like a queen reborn. Powerful, unchallenged, and draped in the rewards of treason. But nothing bought with blood ever lasts. Because when her son, Edward III, came of age, the boy wanted revenge. And not even a crown could soften the memory of his murdered father. Still, Edward III couldn't just outright bring himself to kill his own mother, so he turned his rage onto her lover instead. Roger Mortimer, the man who had risen from nothing to rule England behind Isabella's throne, by the order of Edward III, he was dragged through the streets and hanged like a common criminal.
Poor guy. I mean, he's suffering for her actions. That really doesn't seem fair at all.
Right. I mean, obviously, I'm assuming we have to imagine there was true love there, at least on Isabella's part, because if she's going to make that risk to turn on her husband, invade England, you got to think she loved Roger Mortimer, and, who knows what his intentions were, like if he was that power hungry or not, or if he just loved Isabella and would do anything she wanted, and who really knows. But yeah, he died like a common criminal. Didn't get anything shoved in his ass.
Yeah, it could have been worse, but it still wasn't good.
I guess so.
Hey, anytime you're going through a rough patch in life, just be thankful you don't have a red-hot poker shoved up your ass.
Yes, it gives take this crown and shove it a whole new meaning. Some say, though, that the trauma of Mortimer's brutal execution broke Isabella, and while she stayed in solitude at Castle Rising, visitors to the ruin today speak of horrible disembodied screams echoing through the crumbling halls, cries of a woman in deep grief who had lost everything. And no, it wouldn't be the screams of Edward, because like we said, he died at Berkeley Castle, so not those kinds of screams like of immediate pain, but like emotional agony rather than physical agony. Because at first I thought that, I was like, well, maybe it's Edward, but then I thought, oh, he died at a different castle. So the cries of a woman in deep grief who has lost everything. The she-wolf was now alone.
She was a lone wolf.
That's right, she was now a lone wolf in the worst kind of way. And it's on the upper floors of the keep in the castle's shattered heights where Isabella may once have had her chambers. And it's there that her spirit is said to still linger. And think about it. Obviously, there were less cruel ways to kill Edward II, of course, if that was indeed how they killed him. Who knows if that was really, if it was by Isabella. We do know Isabella led an uprising against him. Who knows if it was her word that gave the order to kill him, especially in that manner. Who knows? But think about it from Isabella's perspective. While she did live the royal life, a life far more blessed than the average life of someone living in medieval Europe, can you really blame her for any resentment that she might have held against Edward? Since she was even a teenager, she was nothing more than a bargaining chip, married away and shipped off at the age of 12 from her home to a full-grown man. And then when she perhaps did find love for the first time in Roger Mortimer, he too is taken from her and killed without dignity. I'd probably be haunting some shit too. Visitors have reported often hearing a manic laughter trailing through the hollow stone corridor. a wild, broken kind of laughter, one of hatred and disdain. The laughter is often tied to the she-wolf herself, a queen gone mad with grief, betrayal, and guilt. But there's another layer to the legend. The Howard family once claimed that during the 18th century, a mental patient was actually housed within the ruins. And if that's true, and in a building so ruined, it's hard to say where they could have even kept someone, then the laughter and screams that chill the blood today might not even belong to Isabella at all, but rather to the fading, forgotten soul. A lost life buried not by history books, but by sheer neglect. In 2016, the Essex ghost hunting team made their way to Castle Rising, drawn by stories of the lingering spirits that may still roam its empty halls. And while exploring the so-called White Room, they snapped a series of photographs, and what they captured still stirs debate. In one image, a figure appeared, a woman in medieval-style dress, standing silent and still, with what looked like a large dog, seated faithfully at her side. The investigators couldn't explain it. No living soul had been standing there when the photo was taken, of course. Investigator Andy Radley was behind the camera at the time and took the snapshot, and he was quoted saying, "I was in the White Room, which is a lovely room thought to be where Queen Isabella spent a lot of her time sewing and so on. There were around 7 of us in the room at the time. My friend turned to me and whispered, 'Can you hear anything?' So I listened carefully, and it sounded like just the sound of a long dress swishing over the stones, coming up the shadowy stairway outside. I decided to take a picture to see what I might capture, and then realized that there was what appeared to be a figure who stood in the middle of the room. When I looked at it on the small lens, I didn't initially think much of it. It was definitely interesting, and I showed everyone, but it wasn't until later when we looked at the picture on a computer that I realized just what I had caught on camera. There is a clear figure from the clothing and the shoulder pads that looks like someone wearing medieval dress. They even look to have something on their head like a queen might wear. But what's most striking is the fact that there is a dog-like shape at her feet. It is very clear, and considering that she was known as the Wolf Queen, it made everyone think that what I had captured could have been the ghost of Queen Isabella. So the whole notion of wolf, it kind of comes from twofold. People think, did she have some sort of a dire wolf beast that she had as a pet? Or it might just be like a nickname like the Wolf of Wall Street. Someone's look out, those guys are a pack of wolves or something, like being that, as we know, probably in most English histories especially, they would probably call her the she-wolf as she led a whole insurrection against her husband and everything. So that's where the term wolf, doesn't necessarily mean she's like a werewolf. It either means she had a wolf as a pet or just like the nickname she got for being a traitor, essentially.
And, she's also extremely cruel, so the wolf label is certainly fitting for someone who ramrodded a guy.
Yes, absolutely, if that's the case, That's one hell of a strap-on. Historians say that the dog was likely a greyhound or a similar breed, the kind of hunting dog that would have been right at home in a royal household centuries ago. But of course, the real question is that woman standing beside the spectral hound Isabella? But considering Castle Rising's long history, she was far from the only noblewoman to have ever walked its halls in silk and sorrow. Some say it might be another lady of the castle, maybe one lost to time, and left off the plaques and pamphlets. Well, whoever it was, it's clear there was something sitting there. Now, the reason some folks are quick to connect that ghostly woman and her spectral dog to Isabella is because of that animal by her side. Some have claimed that it's not a dog, but it's Isabella's pet wolf. In her lifetime, Isabella was never actually called she-wolf. It wasn't even something whispered behind her back like a mean nickname. The infamous title actually didn't come until nearly 500 years after her death, when Thomas Gray, an 18th century poet, decided to take some creative liberties in the name of anti-French propaganda. Here we go, like we said, history, right? You're often getting it from the eye of whoever's writing it.
And this is, centuries later, so he's also basing this on whatever documentation, whatever books were available at the time on Queen Isabella.
Absolutely right.
All he had to read, though, was red hot poker up the ass, and he was like, she-wolf. Fucking she-wolf. I feel like we're beating that like a dead horse, but when you do something like that, I think you deserve to be stuck with that for the rest of your existence.
Yes, if she truly did order that, whoo, man, talk about spit roasting somebody. Goodness gracious. Ooh, just had to take a quick pause there, Creep Street, just to give your poor palpitating heart a rest. If you're enjoying this episode, go ahead and follow us on Facebook, Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod, TikTok at Creep Street Podcast. That's right. And if once a week is not enough for you, just head on over to patreon.com for all sorts of goodies. We got 3 different tiers there, something for every tier. So get your fixins. We even got a free tier where you can listen to the weekly sketches before they go live on the episode. Now, without further ado, back to today's story. In his prose, Thomas Gray painted Isabella as a ravenous beast, a French-born fiend tearing into her poor English husband with what he called, quote, unrelenting fangs. It was poetic blood sport, not historical record, but the image stuck, baby. And before long, Isabella the she-wolf became the Isabella we know today. Fact and fiction fused together, history rewritten by a dang poet. So, that ghostly lady in the photo, she may be many things, but she's probably not keeping a wolf for a pet, which brings us back to the legend. The Isabella wanders the ruins of Castle Rising with her pet wolf walking silently at her side. Here's the kicker. There's no historical evidence that a wolf was ever kept at the castle. None. And no royal kennel lists or scribbled letters about feeding raw meat to a snarling companion. Yet, some folks swear they have heard wolf howls in the dead of night, echoing through the ruins. And as for the photo, the fearsome pup actually looks way more like a smooth-coated hound than a shaggy nightmare wolf. Probably something closer to a greyhound, as we know, than a ghostly dire beast. But whoever Andy captured in that image, Isabella or not, she's just one thread in a larger, weirder tapestry. Because Castle Rising isn't home to just one ghost. There have been plenty of supernatural reports to come from its vacant halls. One visitor was a gal named Dawn Clark. She apparently got more than she bargained for while exploring the castle's cellar. She was walking alone in the dark when suddenly she realized she wasn't alone. She turned around and there, looming behind her, was what she described as a tall, gray-looking guy. He stood completely silent and still, just a pale figure towering over her, solid enough to make her instinctively step back in shock. Her friend, who was standing on the far side of the cellar, didn't see the man, but he did see something. He later said that he watched a gray shadow, maybe a mist or a cloud, circle around Dawn, almost like it was inspecting her. Some think that it might have been the spirit of an old guard, or perhaps a long-dead servant of the castle making his usual rounds, unaware that centuries have passed. And it's interesting, that's something we've encountered a number of times in our haunting tales is, for example, collecting like EVPs, right? You say you have 5 recorders laid out that are right next to each other. Sometimes one can capture something clear as day and none of the others do. And it's like, well, if someone was talking, wouldn't they all capture it?
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's belief that spirits can communicate using electromagnetism, and maybe they can focus their intent on one thing. So maybe in a similar vein, the woman turned and happened to see a more well-formed figure because for whatever reason it was wanting to present to her. Maybe it didn't even know the other guy was there.
Right.
And so it was presenting to her, and that's why her friend only saw like a kind of like a cloud, like a misty cloud, rather than a bipedal humanoid form.
Right. And that's evidence right there. Not just the evidence of the recording, but the absence of the recording on the other devices. That's evidence to something unusual, something highly strange and possibly paranormal right there.
Right. Exactly. Right. It's like, if we just were to hit record on a tape deck and just you and I were chatting, well, it would capture both of our voices. So it would be weird if we played it back and only one of our voices were there. Like, that would be like something like that. It's like, for whatever reason, it must have maybe just wanted Dawn to see it rather than maybe it didn't even know her friend was there, like I said. And so, yeah, interesting how these things may or may not work and how they may play, like we always say, in our conscious. Maybe there's something it's playing, it's appearing to her, it's choosing to appear to her by whatever, evoking, calling out to her consciousness, creating some sort of, even just some sort of a chemical reaction in the brain for her, but not in the other guy to see whatever it is she's seeing.
And like kind of what you were saying, it almost suggests something that's non-physical because of it only appearing on one device. That maybe even if you were there witnessing exactly what the recorder was, you wouldn't necessarily see it either.
Right. Absolutely. That's a great point. Absolutely. Well, an interesting story concerning the castle spirits comes from a man named Norman Fay. He worked at the castle as a custodian for many years. Fay would often be there to open up the castle grounds to paranormal investigation groups and would show them around. During one of these investigations, Fay was taking time for a break when something interesting happened. And here's what he said. I wandered silently around the group, snacking on potato rings, and we had 4 EMF meters lying on the séance table in the center of the room when suddenly all 4 meters sprang to life, registering a high reading. I frivolously asked, "Do you want one?" And a single flash confirmed the entity did. So I placed a single ring on one of the meters and it responded with a single flash. This experience was both profound and highly amusing. To think that great philosophical question regarding afterlife survival was answered in such a mundane way. And I was thinking about that. It would be interesting, especially if there were prisoners kept there and stuff. If they're hungry, if they see someone eating, it might be a way, if they're still living in their time and they just see a man snacking on something, it might be of like a, please, sir, please, anything, any crumb of food, any water, it might be something like that, why they would react to his snacking.
Plus, if you've had those potato rings, they're goddamn irresistible.
They're irresistible. Getting a bag of Funyuns, come on.
Funyuns are today's sponsor.
Funyuns. And that brings us to today's sponsor. Well, visitors and staff alike have reported all kinds of strange activity. Soft weeping from empty chambers, phantom tapping on windows with no one outside, doors creaking open on their own as if some unseen host is still making the rounds. And then there's the mist, that strange creeping fog that drifts through the ruins even on dry days, curling around corners and even coiling around your ankles. Like the thing's gonna pants you. I've never seen that on Ghost Adventures, someone just getting pantsed, you know? Just a purely innocent but a good pantsing.
I mean, There's got to be some paranormal pranksters.
Oh, yeah. Give them a good pantsing. None of this spectral activity really necessarily screams for attention like someone screaming out in the night or something like that, but it does seem as though something or some things are still watching. Now, there is another infamous event in the castle's history that also makes folks rightly feel uncomfortable when visiting. And this, we do know, did for sure happen because it happened in 1852 when records are more, they're more modern and everything. And this is, we do know for a fact, this, for all the things we do know and might not know about Isabella, this we do know. And it concerns a man named John Daw, who was then 49 years old. John had some kind of a mental break. Apparently, he had long struggled with his mental health, and it was now what we might likely call something like a manic depression. And though he'd made dark threats in the past, saying he'd harm himself or worse, take his family with him, no one ever truly believed he'd actually act on it. Neighbors chalked it up to mood swings or nerves, and in those early days of April that year, things actually seemed stable. But that calm was merely the calm before the storm, because beneath that fragile calm, John Daw was unraveling with something dark building within him. One Saturday evening, his employer noticed something wasn't right. He said John seemed in especially low spirits, even for him. He offered to send for a doctor and even called for one. However, after a brief look over, the doctor left with little concern, offering no advice and no treatment. Just that awful 19th century dismissal of, he'll be fine. But something shifted that night. Whether it was the doctor's indifference that tipped the scale or whether John had already been plotting, no one can say for sure. But what we do know is that in the early hours of the next morning, John went batshit. He took a clasp knife and attacked his 43-year-old wife, Honor, and their 7-year-old son, Martin. The horror was not gradual, and it came all at once. What followed was a scene so brutal it still taints the atmosphere around Castle Rising like a damp fog. There was a terrible struggle. Honor tried desperately to escape, fleeing for the front door in a panic, but John caught her before she could get out. He dragged her into the parlor, and there, he murdered her violently. Martin, just 7 years old, also tried to run, but he couldn't outrun his father. There was no mercy in the attack. Both Honor and Martin were found later with their throats savagely slashed again and again. And as their blood soaked into the floors, so too did it soak into the ground, in the very aura of Castle Rising. Almost immediately after the murders, John Daw slipped out the back door, his bloodied hands still clenched, his mind now a storm of guilt and madness. It was like he had realized he had done fucked up, and now he needed a way out. His first attempt was with the same knife he had used to kill his family with. But the ferocity he'd unleashed on them, he couldn't summon for himself. He brought the blade to his own throat, but could only manage a shallow graze. Still desperate, he turned to another method. He cut down the clothesline that hung between two trees and tied himself a noose. He searched for a place to hang, but the rope dumped him right into the dirt when he tried. Thwarted again, John wandered the property in a daze. His trail would later be found zigzagging through the flower beds, across the lawn, as if his ghost had already started its pacing routine. Eventually, he came to a decision. He walked toward the river, the same one that flows beneath the shadow of Castle Rising, which loomed overhead like a silent sentinel watching him, the way it had every day of his life. And now, it would watch him die. John Daw made his way to a shallow bend in the river. The water barely more than 1.5 feet deep. Just a trickle, really. Nothing that should have been capable of taking a life. But John had made up his mind. He lay down, face first in the cold current, and folded his arms out of the way deliberately, almost ritualistically, so his body wouldn't betray him, and so he wouldn't thrash or flinch or rise back up when instinct kicked in. And there in the shadow of Castle Rising that had watched him since childhood, John Daw drowned himself in less than 2 feet of water. So imagine that. Like, it's one thing, I get the, like, you know, obviously we're talking about self-harm, and I'm, you know, certainly not trying to make light of anything. You would think, yeah, that's got to try and work up the gumption to, like, cut your own throat. You know, it's one thing I feel like to cut, like, a wrist or something. To cut your own throat, I mean, that's got to take
an insane amount of willpower.
It truly would. You know, the hanging was probably, for lack of a better word, a good idea, just because that would be
means to that end.
So I'm also surprised if he, to be able to, now granted, drowning's a bit different than slicing your throat, but still, that's quite, to be able to just hold your hands behind your back in no less than like 1.5 feet of water, I mean, that is pretty dang determined for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it would still require an immense amount of willpower, because you'd almost think it'd be easy if you tossed yourself into a lake or something much deeper and maybe, you know, bound yourself in a way that you couldn't. But yeah, that's crazy that he was able to just, in 1.5 feet, 2 feet of water, actually stay there until he drowned.
Right. It's not that people haven't done it before. You know, obviously, people famously have drowned themselves, especially by swimming out to sea or something where you would eventually submerge. But yeah, like I said, the instinct would obviously kick in. And yeah, it almost makes you wonder. It's like, did something almost help him, like hold him down in a way, like some sort of a spectral force, you know, in a way, like because of the evil he committed, it's like, did something almost essentially help him in a way, like essentially hold him submerged?
Right. It's also surprising to be able to commit such an act and then to instantly feel guilt. I mean, he must have been in such a state of rage, because you would think that guilt would take more time to set in if he was actually so determined to go through with that.
Right. A case where you kind of hear that they think that was might have been a case was the Chris Benoit, the wrestler, who in the 2000s murdered his wife and child and then took his own life. Now, granted, that was like a combination of probably steroids and CTE from getting so many concussions that played a role in that as well. They think there's signs that because after he did it, he placed like a Bible under the heads of his wife and his son. There seemed to almost have been a kind of a realization that what he had done, and then he hanged himself with his own weight machine, like a weight set in his gym, his like home gym, which there's also kind of a dark irony there. This, you know, a guy who spent his whole life working on his body, you know, as wrestlers do. There's kind of a dark irony in that would also be where he chose to take his life, which is an episode for another day. That's one I've always wanted to do. It's harder with that because it's just like, so there's no like true crime element to it. It was just a awful, awful, awful tragedy. And like, there's not like a mystery to it, or there's not like a, you know, the police finally caught him, or it's just more just kind of sad all the way around, you know. But yeah, I've thought for a while about doing that one because it is an interesting story and whatnot. But anyway, back to old Johnny Daw floating in the river. No one knew what had happened to the family yet. It wasn't until later that same day that a young man stumbled across John's body lying face down in the river. And at first, it must have looked like some kind of a terrible accident. Others soon arrived, and they dragged the waterlogged corpse from the riverbank. It didn't take long for them to identify that it was John Daw, and the clasp knife found nearby, along with the self-inflicted cuts at his throat, led most to the same conclusion, that he had tried to end his life one way and then eventually settled on drowning himself. But no one yet, though, had gone to the house. No one realized yet what had happened to John Daw's wife, Honor, and their son, Martin. And they had no idea that both of those bodies were laying cold on the other side of the front door. So they carried John Daw's body to a nearby inn, where it laid wet, lifeless, and still clinging to the river's chill. After some hushed debate over what to do next, they made what seemed at the time like the kindest choice. They would take him to his home, to his wife, and break the awful news. A few of the local men volunteered to help, likely imagining they'd, arrive to find Honor in tears, but boy, oh boy, were they in for a grim surprise. They were all ready to offer condolences, a gentle explanation of what had happened down by the river. Maybe even help with funeral arrangements. But what they found was something no one was prepared for. Because John wasn't going home to be mourned, he was going home to meet the rest of the dead. When the men reached Daw Cottage, something felt off right away. The front door was shut tight, barred from the inside, and no one answered the knock. Not a single sound, no sign of life. A chill began to settle over the group. The quiet was not one of grief. It was the feeling that something was very wrong. So they circled to the back door and found it unlocked. One man, a poor soul named Mr. Wilkinson, was the first to step inside, and what he found was not a grieving widow, it was a gosh dang massacre. There in the parlor lay Honor and Martin Daw, butchered in their home, their blood dried in cruel patterns across the castle floor. Whatever sympathy anyone might have held for John Daw moments before was obliterated in that moment. The shock and horror turned their hearts hard. He hadn't just taken his own life, he shattered his whole family and left a nightmare behind for others to walk in on. And thus was added more strange feelings around Castle Rising. The sounds in the grass, the sobbing in the fields, maybe they aren't tied to Isabella at all. Maybe it's this, a tragedy so savage, it soaked the very ground the castle stands on, and can even still be heard by those who come too close. Perhaps whatever pleas for mercy and screams of murder that went unheard in the dark hours of the night in 1852 can still echo and be heard today. People often talk about hearing what sounds like a weeping child. Phantom cries and screams that pierce through the fog like something tearing at the veil between our world and the next. Are they the lost voices of Honor and Martin Daw, trapped in the moment that their lives were torn away? And what about the cries that sound not like death, but of a mind coming undone? Terrifying, animalistic raving. Yes, there are rumors that a mental patient had been held at the castle at one time, and of course stories that Isabella herself went mad within those stone walls, so it could really be chalked up to anything. It could also be different generations of haunting locked within those walls. I know, Gage, we talked about, I can't remember what episode it was, but if we think of we give off energy, and if we think of, especially in terms of maybe not necessarily intelligent hauntings, but residual hauntings as maybe being a trapped bit of energy that's kind of replaying over and over, who's to say that as time goes, it doesn't dissipate? So a more recent tragedy might present a little stronger. Maybe Isabella's haunting, it's still there, but it slowly fades with every passing year, and maybe some more of the more obvious paranormal activity might be coming from the Daw family.
Makes sense, too, that the energy would dissipate over time, because isn't that kind of the case with anything related to energy? I mean, there's no perpetual motion or things, so things do die down. You would think that paranormal activity would be the same way.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it would make, just on paper, I mean, obviously it would make sense, it would seem, especially like we said, for those more residual hauntings, rather than, an intelligent haunting seems to be something different. For whatever reason, the person's spirit is there, whether by choice or trapped there, or it's something that was never human in the first place, maybe something demonic, or even, I guess it could even be something angelic or something like that.
Which also seems to have a goal in the case of a haunting.
Exactly, right, exactly. Like, for example, the ghostly figure that appeared behind that woman, the gray man, it would make sense. Maybe it was a guard that just saw some awful things. Maybe something awful didn't happen to him necessarily, but, if you spent many years walking the same path, guarding the same path, if you saw someone kind of near the castle, you might, it might be your job to just go, hey, can I help you? Is there a reason why? Maybe that's what it was doing. It was he just saw someone, and in his mind is just doing his due diligence, going up and saying, can I help you? Is there a reason you're so close to the castle? Something like that. So
doesn't understand why he's just trying to help. He keeps scaring the shit out of people.
I know, right? Yeah, it's kind of like that. Like, he might just honestly be trying to, help someone he thinks is lost.
It's really hurting his self-confidence. He's going, is it something to do with me? Is there something wrong with me?
Man, that'll do a number on your poor ego. But John Daw and his massacre of his family, that we know was tragically real, his breakdown, his violence, and his final act of despair all happened within sight of the castle walls. So, maybe those terrible cries that echo through the castle at night don't come from the she-wolf of France at all, but from a man whose torment still stains the soil. A ghost not of power and vengeance, but one of regret. And so, this sad, sorrowful tale of murder and madness, and a river that runs far too shallow, brings us to close just one chapter in the long haunted chronicle of Castle Rising. And really, if you think about it, I mean, anywhere in the world, yes, but if you're going back, especially Europe, let's say England in particular, just one haunted castle that dots the landscape of, it's when you kind of zoom out, it's kind of just one note in a microcosm or in a wider spectrum of history, of triumph, of horror, of all manner of things. Yeah, it really does put things in perspective. But Castle Rising, nevertheless, is a place where the stones have been soaked in blood and sorrow. And behind every worn staircase or crumbling arch, there may linger the echoes of human heartache and untimely death. Ones that rattle windows and even sneak into tourist photos. Because while Castle Rising was once the domain of a fearsome queen, its spirits now seem a bit more mischievous than malevolent. But still, tread softly, because not everything that lingers here wants to be seen. And somewhere, someone is watching. I mean, that's kind of going to wrap us up there for our tale, but yeah, so many tales like this, especially when you're talking about history, recorded history that goes back thousands of years. I mean, even in the most peaceful of places, bad things, it's just the law of averages. Bad things are going to happen, whether intentional or accidental or whatnot, whether it's war or murder or, slavery or any numerous horrors that have happened throughout the world, throughout time. It only makes sense that you're going to pick up something that goes bump in the night along the way. But Gage, what do you think? I think it's probably an amalgamation of things, because when you talk about a building that goes back that far, we're talking what? That's like 900 years, I think. If it was built in 1137, that's about roughly 900. I think it'll be 900 years next decade. That's a lot of time to pick up something spooky along the way.
Right. And a lot of these, when we talk about haunted castles, places like Pavalia, places that have been around for centuries and centuries and had all these tragedies or just horrors occur, might sound like places like this are cursed, but you bring up a good point. When you go that long a period of time, the law of averages would say that it's only inevitable that a lot of these horrors would occur. you could probably point to a map and find any place in the world. And if you could look back in time, you would see all kinds of terrible things. So it's hard to say, is this castle one of a dark energy, or is it just a case of probabilities and long stretch of time?
And it makes you wonder, we've talked about how, for example, the Roman Empire is a good example of how many cultures that didn't necessarily write things down as much, like Celtic cultures. The little that we know, there's so much we don't know. Like, the same goes for the United States. Like, before settlers came, like, think about going back thousands of years, the legends that came and went that are kind of forgotten, that there might be hauntings around the United States that we attribute to something more recent, like, oh, this was a battlefield in the Civil War, or this was a this or that, and maybe it's actually what's causing the ruckus is something that we don't even know about, that goes back before, because especially in the U.S., because of modern history, we don't think of the U.S., we think of it as so young. And yes, as a country, yes, it is young, but there was obviously people here long before it was made a country. So it's like, yeah, how much, like, what do we not even know of that might cause things going bump in the night, for sure?
Absolutely. Yeah, you nailed it. I mean, for all of the tales, and a lot of them, are so old that, like we mentioned earlier, we can't know for sure if they have been altered over time or whatnot. But you're absolutely right. Think of all of the incidents that we don't know about, especially considering in the case here of Castle Rising, how long it was abandoned. And so who knows what went on while there was no one around, no record of it.
Absolutely right. So, I mean, we can only point to what we do know happened or think likely happened. But yeah, the story never really ends. But I'll tell you what, Gage, I got a list of names full of folks as red hot as a hot poker.
Oh yeah? Who's that?
The names of our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face via Lungfist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Serve Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Vieren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Ghoulish Gert Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Schur, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, the Freaky Ben Forsyth, the Barbaric Andrew Barry, the Mysterious Marcella, the Hellacious Cale Hoffman, and Pugblorb, the Poltergeist. Yes, folks, that's right. If you want to get on the good naughty list, Santa's good naughty list, just like those folks we mentioned, head on over to patreon.com for all sorts of goodies. I know Gage, by the time this comes out, it'll already be out, but Gage is putting out a new album on Vaporverse on YouTube. Go check that out. There's always links to his channel in the description of the episode. Thank you again, Gage, for joining me, this time on a medieval journey of betrayal and palace intrigue.
Yeah, thank you for having me, man. As always, this one was very interesting, for sure.
All right, folks, citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
Good night and goodbye.